Hello, my name is Dr. Fona Goldman, and I'm a licensed naturopathic physician with a private practice in Stratford, Connecticut. Today I wanted to do a basic introduction to Ayurvedic psychology. Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine. It's over 5,000 years old. And in this, what seems simple, but actually a very profound system, psychology as a first pass is looked at as either too much wind, too much fire, or too much earth if there are imbalances in the mind. And in Ayurveda, wind is considered Vata, fire is called pitta, and earth is called kapha. So I'll be using those terms throughout the talk. Before we get too deep into things, just as a reminder, the information presented here is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For individual medical advice, or if symptoms are severe or worsening, please seek a qualified healthcare professional. And what's nice about Ayurveda is that it can be integrated with other mental health modalities as need be. I already mentioned Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine. It's over 5,000 years old. And again, what it does in this different paradigm of medicine, it recognizes people, it sort of categorizes them, people, symptoms, and diseases as primarily three types. And again, that's wind, fire, and earth, or Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. So what I appreciate about the system is that these ideas of wind and fire and earth and things, people, symptoms generally having a makeup of a combination of wind, fire, and earth. It really gives us a system that is both physically oriented as well as energetically oriented. That'll come into play a little bit more. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But and what's also nice about this is that therapies, remedies, because of these energetic components. For example, if you live a fiery lifestyle, very intense, very goal-oriented, very busy, this will potentially affect both the body and the mind. In the body, it might produce something like inflammation, because inflammation is considered a fiery type of physical symptom. And in the mind, it might create fieriness that would result in something like irritation, impatience, that sort of thing. While different activities and foods, various aspects of lifestyle can affect both the body and mind. Sometimes the body and the mind can actually have slightly different qualities. So it's possible that you can have a very fiery body that shows up with a lot of information, and then in the mind, you end up with more of what are considered windy symptoms. So sometimes there's a little bit of a difference there. The general approach with Ayurveda and with, again, a first pass in terms of correcting imbalances of the mind is that you basically want to look at symptoms. And let's say we determine, we'll go through that the symptoms are primarily windy. You want to give therapies that are the opposite of that. So if we're talking about nutrition, in this case, if you have windy symptoms in the body and mind, you want to give foods that balance that wind rather than exacerbate that wind. Or if you have fiery symptoms in the mind, you want to give foods that are less fiery in nature and more windy and earthy to balance the fieriness. So again, the general approach here is that you want to balance each element, or at least the element that's out of balance, with foods that have the opposite qualities. So let's just give a sort of general symptom picture of wind and fire and earth so that we kind of can identify when somebody shows up how this might present. So if we look at wind or Vata, the general qualities of wind, right? When you look at wind outside your window and you see the trees swaying or clouds moving very fast, what are the qualities of wind? Well, it's light, it's clear, right? You don't actually see the wind, you only see the effects of the wind. It's moving, it's active, right? That's not really a quality. When wind is still, there's actually sort of no wind left. No, wind doesn't exist, right? Wind tends to be cold or at least cooling. It tends to dry things out, and it's pretty rough because it doesn't have a consistent path normally, right? It kind of makes things choppy. Sometimes it blows soft, sometimes it blows hard, sometimes it doesn't blow. It's here, there, and everywhere. So it's kind of rough and inconsistent. So when somebody's in balance mentally through this lens of wind and vata, they tend to be very quick to learn because again their mind is light and it's quick and it's moving, so it picks things up pretty quickly. And also because it's light and quick, people who have sort of a windy mental nature tend to be very spirited or enthusiastic. There's a lot of just spirit and lightness and effervescence about them, because again, that lightness. Again, people who tend to be windy, they also tend to be creative in nature, because their minds are light enough and sensitive enough that they can kind of receive those, sort of creative downloads, and have enough of an acute perception that they can kind of pick those up. Not everybody kind of has that ability. And, they tend to be flexible because they're moving. They're not just their bodies are moving generally, but usually their minds are moving. And they tend to be innovative because they're windy in nature. Again, they're always moving. They're always interested in ideas. And they're sort of, just by their nature, they're not interested in structure and tradition. So it's sort of as a default, they tend to be innovative. Again, because of this light quality of their mind and clear perception, they tend to be fairly intuitive and even psychic, I would say, because again, they can pick up on these subtle energies that not everybody has the ability to tune into, or tune into them well or accurately, or often. And again, because of this sort of lightness and openness and movingness, in their mental sphere, they very often tend to be dreamers. They end up with these creative ideas and or artists. Um, when windy or vata people are out of balance, it shows up as things like difficulty with memory, or insomnia, because their mind is so light, it doesn't hang on to information. It just sort of goes in the head and kind of flies right back out. And insomnia, their mind is so light that they can't kind of settle on down and relax their mind and let their mind, kind of dim down. It's just constantly moving, so they can't let their mind go into deep sleep. As you might guess, because of this constant moving nature, people who tend to be windy or vata can often be scattered in nature. They've always got, usually a bunch of irons in the pot. They've got a bunch of different ideas, different hobbies, different activities. They're always moving. They have a hard time sitting still. And, that can end up also that because they're sort of scattering their energy and they're here, there, and everywhere, they end up not completing a lot of projects. Uh, they have a hard time following through rather than picking up and starting a project typically. And this can actually sort of clinically show up as a lack of focus in terms of something like ADD or ADHD, because our mind is so restless and constantly sort of whirling like the wind. And because of this, because they're sort of whirling about internally, and if they're scattered, and again they're just sort of involved in a lot of activities, they can often get overwhelmed, because then when they actually have to complete something, or maybe they have to complete a bunch of different things at the same time, they'll get overwhelmed. And also this nature of being sort of light and clear and open, that's not just wind, but sort of the quality of space. And so they can show up sort of emotionally as being fearful or lonely or isolated, because wind is moving through space. Windy people tend to be, they're related, And so that sort of too much openness, too much, even space in their home, can make them actually feel even more sort of spaced out and scattered rather than grounded. Um, and because of this sort of space aspect, they can feel isolated from people, and they might feel lonely because of it. And then the fear is sort of that contraction, right? Sort of like when you go out walking on a cold autumn day, and it's just come off of summer and you're used to the warm weather. You kind of want to scrunch up your shoulders and protect yourself from the cold and the wind. Fear is kind of like that internal and emotional level. And then also, this can also translate not just sort of on the mental emotional plane, but people who are windy in nature, if it translates into the nervous system on a physical level, it can show up as something like spasms and tremors, that sort of shaking and quaking, the way that the wind moves through the trees and the branches, like this picture would indicate. So fire, the nature of fire, traditionally in Ayurveda, the qualities of fire that are attributed to fire are oily, sharp, hot, light, fleshy, spreading, and liquid. So those are probably, as you look at that list, you're like, okay, well, those seem sort of physical, but how does that translate to the mind? Well, when a fiery person, predominantly fiery person, is in balance, that heat or that spark within them can manifest as a lot of charisma. They can be very engaging because they have this sort of like light, they're sort of like the sun, they naturally, because of their intensity and the heat, within their personality, they tend to be very engaging. And because of the charisma and engaging bit, they often end up being leaders and teachers. Um, and another reason is that people who are fiery in nature, they tend to be organized, goal oriented, and ambitious. So, like in the quality list, you see spreading and liquid. So, to a certain extent, that's what ambition is, right? You kind of want to spread, spread your influence and that sort of thing. Um, and then the goal oriented and being organized, right? The more organized you are, there's sort of like more sharpness in the way that your mind's categorizing things and processing things and putting things together, as opposed to it's like, well, we'll start with, we'll do step B and then we'll do step Z and then we'll go back to A, and you know um, so they're pretty systematic. And again, in terms of their thinking, they tend to be the most analytical of the three types. Um, yeah, and so you can start to see some of the how some of these qualities translates into the actual outward manifestation of their mind. Again, because of this heat, sharpness, intensity, the way that fire is, they tend to be very passionate people. They're also enthusiastic and they tend to be intense. And also the fieriness of their mind, they have very strong memory as well as perception. So they're pretty sharp cookies. And we even say that, right? Sharp cookie. I mean, there's a reason why we sort of intuitively even have words to describe people who have a fiery nature. When fiery people are out of balance, however, this can show up as somebody who lives too much in their head. People who are fiery tend to have very strong mental sphere and even intellect. But the thing is, it can get so strong that they might end up driving themselves and others way too hard, because it's like they have this long list of things in their head. They have a lot of drive and ambition to accomplish those things, and they just sort of expect their body and the bodies around them to keep up with their internal task list. So that can be difficult in certain respects. This fieriness also can show up as irritation or impatience. It can show up as sharp and cutting speech. So people who really have that sort of sharp edge to their voice or their way of speaking or even their word choice, that's an indication of fiery person. They tend to have a lot of fire, even energy in their voice. They don't tend to be squeaky voices or airy voices or grounded voices. Like they sort of command attention because of that fieriness. again, if they get out of balance, it can develop into something like anger, violence, even cruelty, because again, you're starting to see how this kind of heat and intensity and sort of sharpness and controlling really nature can get askew. They can become judgmental, rigid, skeptical, because again, they're in their head and they're compartmentalizing, right? They're categorizing. That's just sort of how their mind processes the world, but it can become a problem if they become sort of slave to these sort of rigid criteria that they have internally. They also tend to be very skeptical. As patients, for example, when they come into the office, these are typically the people, because they're sort of in their head processing, and sort of categorizing everything that you're saying. Um, they're typically the ones who are the most sort of analytical and have the most objections or questions about um, what's going on. And they sometimes because of the skeptical nature, they have a harder time buying in. They sort of have to be convinced, in an analytical way for them to even buy in to, doing something that they're not used to. And they can get anxious, but it's a different sort of anxiety than somebody who's more of a Vata or wind type person. Oh, Vata wind type person. They always have this sort of almost general anxiety. It's not necessarily, you're not able necessarily to point to certain triggers. But if you look at the anxiety of fiery or pitta people, it tends to be performance anxiety related. So if they can't meet deadlines, or if they don't do well on an exam, or if they don't get a promotion, right? So you can see that's kind of different than somebody who's just sort of naturally restless and moving and scattered and overcommitted, the way a Vata or windy type would show up. And the third group here are the earthy or kapha people. So the qualities in Ayurveda, they're associated with earth or kapha type people. Cool, heavy, slow, smooth, soft, wet or oily, sticky and cloudy. So like the earth, like mud, right? So these are sort of more qualities you would see with them. And how does that show up in the mental, emotional sphere? Well, when they're in balance, these folks are sort of the salt of the earth. I mean, they're calm. They don't get agitated much. They don't get overly excited. They're sort of measured in their approach and response to things. They're very loving and comforting, compassionate even. And because of their sort of like steadiness, internal steadiness or stableness, they're just sort of stable, solid people generally. They tend to have a very nurturing, helping, caretaking type of profile. Um, they may be a little bit slower to learn because Earth doesn't move nearly as quickly as wind or fire. But the thing is, it's solid. So whenever they do take into their mind, they'll remember it for a long time because it's set in stone, so to speak, in their mind. When earthy or kapha people get out of balance, this shows up as difficulty making changes because they're so solid. Even if they're contemplating making a change, it may take them a long time. They may have a lot of setbacks because their general constitution is one of inertia, right? I mean, they're just not of the sort of general makeup of being, quick and moving, and that sort of thing. So they can get stuck in ruts, and mentally they can get stuck in ruts in the ways of like something like depression, right? When their mind gets too heavy and too sticky, too cloudy, like they can't kind of perceive things accurately, and their mind gets heavy, and then they get depressed. Um, they can also, because of their sort of kind and compassionate nature, they may end up supporting others more than themselves. So they may end up kind of sacrificing their own goals or dreams to support other people. Sometimes they do this intentionally. Sometimes it's just what happens, and then years later they realize, oh wow, I've given all my life energy to other people and what they wanted. what do I want? Sometimes they don't even know because they're so focused on helping other people. And also this sort of heaviness or sticky quality, it can show up as greed and attachment. So of the three types, they don't like change. They don't like to lose things. They like to sort of accumulate and build. That's just their nature. They tend to be, for example, with money, they tend to be the best savers because they like to. That again, that's what you do with earth. That's what you do with mud, right? Is that like you build things with it. So even mentally, it shows up in that type of way. Okay, so that was an introduction to sort of how to spot somebody who's windy or vata, fiery or pitta, earthy or kapha. So now, what do you do about it? So there are definitely lifestyle changes that can be made, and of the lifestyle changes, the one that's used first and primarily is nutrition. People really don't recognize, especially in the Western world, how much what you eat affects both the body and the mind. And even though there is that saying, you are what you eat, Ayurveda really sort of takes that very literally and almost to the extreme in terms of, for example, on this slide, there are three pictures here. So there's bell pepper, there's ginger root, and then there's goat cheese. So just based on what we've talked about so far in the last few minutes, of these three foods, which one intuitively would you say is the windiest, right? And if you think of the qualities of light, moving, airy, clear, right? Which one? Cold. Well, hopefully, with those sorts of qualities, between these three foods, you would recognize that the bell pepper is actually the most windy or vata food of the three. Okay. And all foods have a combination of wind, fire, and earth, just like all people have a combination of wind, fire, and earth. But typically, you will have one or two of those elements that are more predominant in somebody or in the symptoms or disease that they present with, whether they're physical or mental. So again, we have okay. So if we look at the next one here, fiery. Of the three, bell pepper, ginger root, or goat cheese, which one is the most fiery? So again, you've got to think about which one's hot, which one's sharp, which one's, light. And of the three, hopefully, you've also determined that the ginger root is of the three the most fiery, right? And then earthy, so again, sticky, cloudy, cool, heavy of these three foods, the goat cheese would be the earthy product. So if you were a fiery person, you want to do less of the same. So you want to do less ginger root and you'd want to do more bell pepper and goat cheese to balance out, cool down that fiery nature. If you were a windy type, right, you wouldn't want to, eat too many bell peppers. You'd want a little bit of heat to warm you up since, wind is cold. You want a little bit of heat from the ginger root and then you'd want that groundedness that comes from the goat cheese to balance that windy quality that you have. If you're an earthy person, so again, earth, heavy, sticky, cloudy, if you're an earthy person, rather than eat a lot of goat cheese of these three foods, you would be better off eating the lighter, airier bell pepper and the warming ginger root spice. So again, as just a general introduction to one, how to recognize how wind, fire, and earth, or vata, pitta, kapha, show up on the mental emotional plane for people. And then also, how do you look at foods to balance that? Now, I've actually produced 3 separate videos on each of the constitutions and nutritional recommendations for each. So it goes in each one. So I have a video on pitta and another one on vata and another one on kapha. And that goes into a lot more depth on each constitution type. So you can dive more deeply into it, depending on which one you want to learn about first. So that's it. That's our introduction. So again, with Ayurveda, it seems sort of simple, but it's amazing how much this system I've seen in my clinical practice really help people. And it's kind of a nice system because people, anybody off the street really can kind of wrap their mind around, oh, okay, this food is kind of windy because it's like, dry, cold crackers. And this food is more fiery because it's, oily, it's fried, it's intense, like hot pepper. And oh, okay, this food is like more earthy because it's like heavy and sticky, like dessert, a lot of our ice cream, right? So it's nice in that way. And there again, I in the other videos, I get much more into details and extensive food lists and things like that. So I'll link the playlist for Ayurveda and those other videos so you can tap into those as you will. Right. So thank you for your time, and until the next time.